Good evening. I've got a stage director here for this podcast, so I have to sort of watch what I'm doing, and I might get odd signals in the middle saying you can't stand there, you have to stand here, but we'll see how it goes. But anyway, good evening to all of you. It's very nice to see such a full room, and being cast on the video cast as well is something new for me, so I'm just going to wave to all the people who are out there as well, assuming there's thousands of people out there who could be interested in the talk tonight. What we're going to be doing is talking under the title of a range of talks that I've done here called What Has Psychology Ever Done for Us? And tonight I'm particularly going to be talking about the social psychology of relationships. There's been a whole series of these. I started off, Alec asked me to do one talk on happiness, which I did, and he then asked me to do a series of 3 talks under the general rubric of What Has Psychology Ever Done for Us? And we're now at talk number 5, which either says something about Alec's persuasiveness or says something about my gullibility. I'm not quite sure. But I have to say that the talk I'm giving tonight, the one on psychology of relationships, has been by far and away the hardest one I've had in terms of preparing it. And that's for 2 reasons. One is because relationships is such a huge issue. And when I first started preparing this talk, I ended up with something that could have gone on for 3 weeks rather than just the time I've got here tonight. So a lot has to be left out. And choosing what to put in and what to leave out is quite difficult. But the other reason was because my partner's here tonight, and I knew she would be in the audience, and I thought, well, we're getting married in August, you see, and I thought, if I say the wrong thing tonight, I may well find I'm on my own in August. So I had to show it to her first, but she's still here tonight, so I'm quite hopeful that it's okay. So I'm going to be talking, as I say, about the psychology of relationships. And with apologies for all the things that are going to be left out, this is roughly the kinds of areas that I'm looking to cover tonight. When Alec asked me to do this, I suspect that he had in mind these kinds of things, because this is a set of headlines taken from the online magazine Psychology Today, which I get regularly on my Facebook page, and it has all these wonderful things about how to deal with your relationships. And I'm sure that's probably what Alec expected, maybe what some of you are expecting as well. But in actual fact, I'm not going to start with today at all. I'm actually going to start 20,000 years ago. In this time, which was the end of the Ice Age thereabouts. And the guy I'm interested in is this guy. And this guy, some of you may or may not recognize, is a guy usually called Cro-Magnon man. That's a little bit of a misnomer, but he's known as the first anatomically modern human being. He was the first one in the Homo sapiens line that was pretty well much exactly like us. And he's quite interesting because he had a brain very much like us, and that brain had a size of about 1600 cc's. Now, question time coming up. We're descended from this guy. Do you think we have a brain which is 15% bigger, or a brain which is 15% smaller? All those for bigger? Hands up. No? What? Yeah. So
varies much of people's physical height.
Yes, I know, but we're talking about averages here.
I would say slightly bigger.
Well, in fact, we're actually smaller. I think most of you guessed I wouldn't be asking the question if it was the obvious answer. But the thing about it is, why is it actually smaller? And one of the rationales that's been given for it was this. And I don't actually mean Facebook itself, because clearly that wasn't around 20,000 years ago. What I do mean is social networking. Because some very interesting things happened at the end of the Ice Age. That up till that time, Cro-Magnon man and his cronies had been living in quite small societies, quite small numbers, struggling to survive in a very hostile environment. And at the end of the Ice Age, with the environmental change, we had a massive explosion in population amongst primitive man. And instead of living in very small, isolated groups, man began to live in much larger groups, much larger social groups. And that seemed to bring about some changes. And the thing that's been reckoned in terms of what happened to human beings in that time was that man became domesticated. And by that I mean that instead of having the kinds of skills that were necessary to survive as a kind of individual pioneer, the really important skills for the survival of the species became how well can you live with other people? How well can you actually get on with relationships? How well can you actually work together with other people for the success of a tribe? And the idea is that in that situation, what happens is that some of the skills that the brain might have had in Cro-Magnon man are no longer as necessary. And other skills, which are about things like relationships, become more important. So the brain becomes more specialized and actually becomes smaller. And that's also because a smaller brain is more energy efficient. The brain uses up something like 20% of the energy in the body. So you don't want your brain to be any larger than it has to be to do the things that you need to do. And so the idea was that our brains shrunk because we became social creatures, because relationships became central to the way in which we were actually living. And in fact, it's not just with human beings. There's been some interesting studies looking at animals in terms of what happens to animals when they become domesticated. And this was a famous study by a Russian scientist who was looking at silver foxes. He was particularly interested actually in how wolves turned into domestic dogs, but wolves were a bit big to work with, so he worked with silver foxes instead. And what he did was he bred several generations of them, choosing them only on the basis of how domesticated they might be. So if they snarled and tried to bit their trainers when they fed them, if they shied away, looked very frightened in the presence of human beings, they didn't get bred. But if they showed any pro-characteristics in terms of dealing with human beings, if they were willing to approach, if they showed less fear, if they showed some positive traits, then they did get bred. And the interesting thing is that on that alone, on that domestication trait alone, breeding them after 40 generations produced huge changes in these animals. They changed in terms of their color, they changed in terms of their brain size, they changed in terms of their attitude, they changed in terms of their foxy smell. So what this was really proving was that domestication alone can actually bring about quite radical genetic changes in the species, and therefore this notion that human beings became domesticated and their brains became smaller actually fits quite well into this picture. And we can see this with lots of other domesticated animals as well. I'm going to do a bit of an experiment with you. This is an experiment which actually comes from 1944. It's quite a well-known one. And so I'm going to show you a little bit of film for a minute or so, and I want you to watch the film, and at the end of the film, I'll ask you what you thought was going on. So here we go. Okay, I'm not going to ask for too long, but would anybody like to say what they thought was happening in that?
It's the storyline from EastEnders from 1992 to 1988.
Pretty good, okay. Anybody else?
It's a bunch of violent
Well, the interesting thing, I'm not, there's no right answer to this, so I was quite interested in the answers you gave. But the point is that most people, when they watch that, do in fact make it into some sort of story. And quite commonly the story might be something like this, and they say there's no right answer, so this is just one interpretation. They see it as a sequence of events which are actually about the relationship between characters in the film, despite the fact that it's actually just triangles and circles and a few lines here and there. But they actually automatically see it as relationships. And this, in fact, is something that's very true of the way in which human beings actually look at things. We're actually evolved to look for relationships and to look at relationships and to understand things in terms of relationships. And that video was one, say, from 1944, which was used to show a wide range of people looking at that. Nobody could see it without thinking relationship in some sense. So that's quite interesting. So from the very beginning, this is where your relationship chance to go, well, right, okay. Right from the very beginning of life, we actually see this in the way in which children develop. We see this tendency to look for and think of things in terms of relationships, because babies are not blank slates. They come with a kind of operating system, baby operating system. And right from the beginning, they're looking for certain kinds of things. They're actually recognize the mother's voice very early on. They recognize the mother's smell. They prefer looking at biological movement, especially people. They recognize human shape, and the bit about extra arms is, even from a very young age, if you stick an extra set of arms around the waist of somebody, the baby looks extremely puzzled, because it's already worked out that human beings don't generally have that. They prefer looking at faces. They prefer looking for social interactions with people. They like people to interact with them. They respond very strongly to smiling faces. I was sitting on a train the other day there, and a baby turned around to look at me and goes, see, even though it never seen me in its life before and it's quite young, they follow the gaze. So if you're looking at a baby and the baby's looking at you and you look away, the baby will automatically follow your gaze because it's recognizing that you're looking at something that might be interesting for it. They actually begin to attribute relationships. They begin to understand that things are related to each other. They're related to the people around them. And the whole development of language is based around the notion that they're able to create relationships between what you're saying and doing and the things that they're seeing and observing. So right from the very beginning, babies are actually very interested in relationships. And what's interesting too is what happens if they are not able to do that. So one of the early studies was a chap called Bowlby, who was a psychologist who engaged in maternal deprivation, that children were left in cots, they were fed, they were cared for, they were cleaned, but they were denied interaction on that relationship basis in order to see what happened. And oddly enough, or perhaps not very oddly at all, the babies became quite disturbed. Wouldn't be allowed to do that kind of experiment these days, regarded as highly unethical nowadays. But even nowadays, we have other examples that we can look at that tell us the same sort of message, that if you deprive children of relationships, you're heading for trouble. And one of the interesting things was looking at Romanian orphanages when Romania came into the European community. And it was discovered there were a lot of children in Romanian orphanages who were a bit like Bowlby children, in that they were receiving basic care, but were denied relationship care. And many of them had severe problems, even when they were actually perhaps adopted by other families later on. And the other thing which I came across a lot in my career as a clinical psychologist was Asperger's syndrome. And that's one of the things which is usually talked about as one of the autistic spectrum disorders. And it's characterized by people who are very intelligent, but have real difficulty with relationships. They have real difficulty understanding emotions and relationships. They're very puzzled. As one of my patients said to me, just tell me what the rules are and it'll be all right. Because they just can't understand the subtlety of relationships in that kind of way, and it causes immense problems for them as they get older. And of course, if you've been reading your news recently, you will realize that there was one young lad in America who was suffering from Asperger's, who was so disturbed by this that he went off and shot some people because he found it impossible to make relationships. Very sad case. Fortunately, very rare. I mean, Asperger's people are not people who are generally dangerous to anybody, except perhaps themselves occasionally. But that was just a case in point. So when people are developing relationships, it happens from a very early stage. And this was an interesting study that was done in Glasgow in 1964. The professor involved, Rudolf Schaefer, was actually my professor at Strathclyde University, oddly enough, but not in 1964, I hasten to add. And what they were looking at was different stages of relationship development that children go through. And I'm not going to go through this in any detail, but the things that I really wanted to point out was that from a very early stage indeed, from something like 6 weeks, children are beginning to see relationships as something key to the way in which they're living and developing. And certainly by 9 months, well within the first year, they're actually developing a wide set of relationships and a wide set of understanding of what relationships actually mean. So right from a very early stage, relationships are absolutely central to the young child's understanding of the world and what's happening to it. And that's very important because, as we say, as I was saying, in these studies that were carried out, shown that if people don't form these kinds of relationships, then there tend to be major disruptions in their ability to lead ordinary everyday lives, and you get a lot of behavioral problems occurring. That children diagnosed with several psychiatric disorders are found to have had disturbed childhoods where it was difficult for them to actually form meaningful relationships. And even children adopted at the age of 6 months or more have a higher risk of attachment problems because, as I was saying earlier on, a lot of this learning about attachment happens even well before the first 6 months. And if they haven't learned it well at that point, then even later on with corrective care, it may be difficult for them to actually adapt and relate in that kind of way. On the other hand, if children are securely attached, there are very long-lasting benefits to that. So if children early in their lives experience good attachment, good relationships with people, they tend to have good self-esteem, they tend to have strong romantic relationships, ability to self-disclose to others, healthy, happy, and lasting relationships. So what happens to the child at that stage is absolutely essential, and it's something which I'm saying is really fundamental to the whole notion of how we operate as human beings. And the child will go on and develop further relationships as it goes through its early life. Initially, that will be with the mother, but then will become with other family members. The range of relationships begins to extend further as the child gets older. They learn by watching and listening. The terrible twos, and any of you here who've been parents will recognize the terrible twos, when children suddenly begin to realize that their relationship with other people is not the fact that the other people are there to always provide them with everything they want instantly. And this is a bit of a puzzle to the child because early experience suggests that people are always responding to it in terms of care. And you get to the terrible twos and the child suddenly realizes that it's being denied things sometimes and its relationship with people is not quite what it thought it was. And one of the things the child then begins to develop is what's called a theory of mind. It begins to realize it's not just me here. Other people out there actually have their own personalities and their own minds and are thinking about things in their own way. And the child has to begin to adjust its notion of what relationships are to take account of the whole world's not actually centered on me. So it begins to learn things like sharing and trust. If it's got brothers and sisters, then it begins to learn how to deal with these within the family environment. The upbringing has to be not too strict and not too lax. If it's too lax, the child is still getting away with everything and still tends to be stuck in this terrible twos stage. If, on the other hand, the relationship is too strict in terms of the upbringing, the child doesn't develop a real sense of self-responsibility because it's being told exactly what to do all the time, and it simply has to obey orders. But it's quite important for the child's development that it actually begins to learn that it's responsible for a lot of its behavior and can actually make its own choices. So not too strict, not too lax, in order to develop that sense of self and self-control. And we know abusive relationships in childhood are damaging throughout life. No two ways about it. And we see that, unfortunately, quite a lot in problem families we look around society. Family was one thing, but in fact, it's been suggested that, although it starts the process going, is by no means the most important thing that's actually happening to children in terms of relationships. The most important thing is actually the relationships they begin to make with their peers, people that they see as being people like themselves. And in that sense, school is a very important influence on the way in which people think about and develop relationships. It's the first time that most children are actually in very large groups and have to begin to work out the complexities of relationships that then leads to. So the first thing they tend to do is to identify people like me. So, who is there in this vast range of people that I can relate to because they seem to be a bit like me? And beyond that, they begin to develop the notion of in-groups and out-groups. The people who are like me are okay, I'll relate to them. People who are not like me, not so sure, don't necessarily want to relate to them. So they're beginning to develop this notion of complexities of relationships by this stage of school. And this goes on right throughout the school career. It's often particularly evident during the teenage years. But they also discover that a lot of the relationships are power relationships. They discover things about bullies and victims, for example. And they discover issues around conformity, being like everybody else. And you know that most teenagers, particularly young children, want to be like all their mates. They want to have the same toys, wear the same clothes, watch the same television programs as the people they see as being in their in-group. But at the same time, there's competition and conflict, which is often with the out-group. And this is an experiment which was carried out by a psychologist called Sharif. And it's called the Robbers Cave experiment because the Robbers Cave was an American summer camp. And what they did was that they took 22 boys to this summer camp and they arbitrarily divided them up into two groups. One group was called the Rattlers and the other one was called the Eagles. And they deliberately set out to create competition between these groups to see what would actually happen. So they had them competing to win games. They had them competing for various favors and so on. And sometimes they rigged it. So that one of the things, for example, was that there was a picnic and they delayed one group going to the picnic so that by the time they got to the picnic, the other group had eaten most of the good food. And they were interested to see what this would do in terms of the way in which relationships would develop between the two groups. And you might not be surprised to hear it didn't do very good at all. But in fact, it actually got quite serious. There was serious conflict, serious aggression, and some violence. So much so that not only were the boys very clear about who was in my group and who wasn't and what they were going to do badly or what they thought badly about the other group, but the researchers became very alarmed and actually had to reverse the trial because it became so disturbing that they thought, can't let it go like this. And they had to look at how you actually reintegrated these groups through cooperative activities. But it was a very good example of how this sort of in-group and out-group notion can very quickly develop notions about relationships which become extremely powerful in terms of not only self-identity, but how you're identifying the other people round about you and how you might actually react and respond to these people. So relationships have a lot of positives for human beings. That if you look at human beings in relation to other animals, you find that we are very good at some things compared with other animals. We're very good at sharing, very good at cooperation, very good at things like altruism, very good at concepts like fairness, and concepts like helping. So that's the good side. On the other hand, it sometimes gets a bit tricky, because sometimes this business of relationships makes it very difficult for us to decide what to do. And some of you may know this, which is known as the trolley dilemma, which is a situation where here you are, you've got a tram running along. It's one of the good reasons why Edinburgh's only got one tram track. You can't do it. You've got two tracks, and this is a runaway tram, which is either going to go down this track and kill this person, or go down this track and kill this person. And here are you, up here with the switch, deciding which track the train is going to go down. And you present people with this as a moral dilemma, and people get a bit upset about it, but eventually what they decide is they're going to save the five. Poor one person, tough luck. But that's the way it goes. Better to save the five. But if you start to introduce things like relationships into this, this is another scene where, in fact, we've got the same five people on the track, and this is a guy standing on the bridge with this guy here, and he reckons if I push this guy off onto the track here, it'll block the tram, and it'll save these five people. So, kill one person, save five, same problem as the other problem. What do people do? They save the one, because they're standing next to this guy, and they see themselves as having a relationship with this person, even if it's somebody they don't actually really know. This notion of relationship, just by proximity, is so powerful that they'll actually reverse the logic of their previous decision, that it's better actually to save this guy and let the five die.
Essentially, they actually choose to sacrifice themselves.
No, I don't think they do, generally. It's a good point. Your relationship with yourself is probably pretty good, but there we go. Yes, it's one I hadn't thought of that. I must remember that one. So, yeah, this business of relationships gets a bit complicated sometimes. One of the things that tends to happen, and it was the sort of thing that was flagged up by the boys' camp, is that we tend to begin to develop stereotypes about other people that determine the way in which we actually respond to them. So it's, I'm okay, and those people who are like me are okay, but those people who are not like me are not okay. And we get into statements like, all someone's are something. So all immigrants are welfare scroungers, or all Muslims are terrorists, or whatever it happens to be. Completely erroneous statements. But people begin to classify life in that kind of way. They begin to have sort of all are type statements about life. And these negative attributions, when they're very negative about people, like all Scots people are drunks, or whatever it happens to be, they're more easily attributed to groups that are easy to pick out. So it's one of the reasons why, for example, things like skin colour has been the grounds for a lot of discrimination. It's very easy to spot someone who has a different skin colour from oneself, and therefore very easy to make them the butt of negative stereotypes. And when people do that, they then often start to depersonalise the other people. They're not really people like me. They're different somehow. So we don't actually have to think about them the same way. We don't have to treat them the same way. And of course, you get extreme examples of this, and you can look at things like the way in which Jews were treated during the Second World War. They were regarded as somehow inferior. They're not real people. Therefore, it doesn't actually matter if we send them all off to camps to kill them all off, because it's not as if we were doing it to real people like us. And so this notion of depersonalization is actually an extremely dangerous notion which begins to develop as people begin to use stereotypes. And what's even worse, of course, is that very often they will use these stereotypes to actually attribute their own problems to the people they see as the inferior group. And that was certainly true about Jewish people, for example. They were the cause of all the economic problems in pre-war Germany, according to Hitler and the Nazi Party. It was all their fault. Therefore, it was okay what we did to them because they deserved that in some way. So this is a very negative aspect of the way in which we begin to think about and develop relationships. So in terms of the negative aspects, we see a lot of these things occurring. We get sexism, people develop stereotypes about what men and women are like, racism, homophobia, religious intolerance, discrimination of all sorts, caste distinction, as we've been saying very recently in the news in India, for example. If you're in the lower caste, you don't really matter. Therefore, we don't have to go and chase up when your daughters are missing or when they're possibly being hung from trees or whatever, because we are superior caste. You're below us. We don't have to think about that. Tribalism, and you could argue that, in fact, some of that is coming out in the Scottish independence debate. Do we have a degree of tribalism and nationalism, for example, there? All the English are terrible, or all Conservatives are terrible, or all Scot Nats are raving lunatics, or what does it happen to be? Again, we see the same tendency to group people into in-groups and out-groups and to begin to develop stereotypes and ways of thinking about people that are actually not helpful and begin to take us away from seeing them as real people and judging them on the basis of their individual merits. I have to say that my mother, for example, was an old-school Scotswoman. She's been dead for a few years now, but she was an old-school Scotswoman. She was brought up in the days of the Second World War, when Germans were terrible people, Chinese were terrible people, Asian people were terrible people, and she was immediately biased against all of them. But the interesting thing was, I had Chinese friends and I had Asian friends. I used to bring them home. She loved them, because when she actually met them as individuals and dealt with them as individual people, stereotype went out the window because she was dealing with them as real people. It's quite interesting just to watch that, the difference between some of the things she might sometimes say and how she actually behaved in the real life situations. So these can be extremely damaging, particularly when they begin to underlie the way in which we direct our overall behaviours. And we can look at international relationships and see the same thing is going on at a very large scale. So who are our friends and allies? Well, we tend to look at cultures that are the same as our culture. We think the Americans are pretty good, the Europeans are not too bad most of the time, but see some of these other cultures in Africa and so on, we don't really understand them very much. They're not operating on the same basis as we are. Therefore, not too sure about them at all. Except where there's mutual gain to be made. If they've got some resources that we want, that's okay. They're our friends. They can be our allies because there's something in it for us in that sort of situation. Or perhaps we've got mutual enemies and we're actually prepared to join up with them to fight somebody else that we think is even worse. Who are our enemies? Opposed cultures, people with opposed goals and beliefs, people who are competing with us for resources and power, and people who are threats to our friends. So again, we're seeing this business of in-groups and out-groups simply reflected onto the international scale in terms of relationships. And it gets pretty peculiar at times. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. And you think, hang on a second, this begins to get pretty convoluted in terms of how we begin to understand the power of relationships. One of the funny things, though, and you might think war was the ultimate situation where relationships break down, but psychological research has shown that even in terms of war, relationships remained very important. It was looked at in terms of the Napoleonic and Civil Wars and the number of people who got killed by the enemy in terms of the shooting that went on. And it was reckoned that in terms of the kinds of weapons that people were using and the kind of accuracy that people could actually attain, that there should have been an awful lot more deaths than there actually were. So, as I say, in the Napoleonic and Civil Wars, they were expecting a casualty rate of something like 50% amongst opposing troops. But in fact, the hit rate was only about 1 or 2 per minute. Why was that? Well, in the First World War, one of the military people was walking up and down the trenches and noticing that most of his men were actually firing into the air. They didn't actually want to shoot somebody. This sense of human relationship was still there, even though they were the enemy and they were shooting back. And he had to go around beating people up, saying, "Get your guns down, fire, hit them," because they didn't. And of course, one of the classic things from the First World War that many of you have heard of is the Christmas truce, where the two sides got up out of the trenches and were playing football in no man's land. Because even in war, this notion of human relationships was extremely powerful. And in World War II, it was reported that the firing rate in battles was only about 15 to 20%. So a lot of the time, people weren't actually firing at the enemy at all. And in Vietnam, an interesting statistic, for every enemy soldier killed, 50,000 bullets were fired. A lot of these bullets were clearly not being aimed at the enemy. Otherwise, the casualty rate would have been much higher. And this has been a big problem, actually, for military forces throughout the world, that, in fact, even in that situation, even with relatively trained troops, there's this strong sense of human relationship that means that people are a bit diffident about actually being the person to shoot somebody. You find this in firing squads as well, things like that. One of the people in the firing squad always has a blank bullet, so that the person can always go away and tell themselves, well, it wasn't actually me, I had the blank. Because this sense of relationship is there and so important. And in fact, the solution that's actually being applied now by military forces is to look for more impersonal ways of killing people. If you send a drone, for example, the drone doesn't have this problem of having a relationship with the people that it's killing. And so there's something quite serious going on here in the way in which we are depersonalizing, reducing the relationship component of even these conflicts. So even in the worst situation of war, the notion of human relationships remains a very important one. But let's move on to personal relationships. Homo sapiens sapiens. I was saying earlier on that Cro-Magnon man was in the Homo sapiens line. We are Homo sapiens sapiens, which is the even wiser wise man, and I sometimes worry about that a bit, I think. Who decided that then? But anyway, that's where we are. We appear to need contact with other members of our species. It seems to be extremely important to us. There's an experience of powerful drive to form and maintain close, lasting relationships. We usually form relationships quite easily. It's something that comes very naturally to us, and we're very reluctant to end relationships. Maintaining relationships also tends to be very important to us. And what we tend to seek is an optimal balance between social contacts and solitude. That we don't want people all the time, but on the other hand, if we are unable to make contact with people, then we feel seriously deprived. And one of the interesting things, of course, is that we tend to use solitary confinement as punishment. And this was an exercise that was carried out looking at people in San Quentin a long time ago, where solitary confinement was actually used as a punishment. What they found was that prisoners used all kinds of inventive ways of trying to make contact with other people, like shouting down the toilets, because the toilets carried the sound to a neighbouring cell, and things like this, because it was extremely important to have any kind of contact. And this was the exercise yard, and this picture was showing that, in fact, people tend to cluster in groups. In the exercise yard, people don't go off completely on their own in that sort of situation. Even in the prison situation, making relationships with other people was actually seen as quite crucial. And as I say, solitary confinement was very much seen as a punishment. Very important to health. Strong positive relationships have a number of real benefits, which actually show up in people's health and well-being. So we know that people with good relationships tend to suffer less from stress-related diseases, a whole variety of stress-related diseases. We know that people who've got good relationships tend to have better immune systems. They're actually more resistant to illness and sickness in a whole range of ways. We know it reduces cardiovascular problems, so things like strokes and heart attacks tend to be much fewer amongst people who've actually got good, strong, positive relationships. We know it decreases depression and anxiety problems. And sometimes I'm lecturing to people about psychology and retirement. And we did a bit of work for GPs at one point, which was looking at how do you detect depression in older people, because very often it's hard to detect. They tend to present themselves with physical problems rather than psychological problems. And we said, well, it's easy, we're psychologists, we can give you a whole range of tests you can use. And the GP said, yes, but I've only got 7 minutes with each client. What can I do in 7 minutes that's going to tell me, is this somebody who's at risk? And we eventually discovered there was one question you could ask, which was actually a very good indicator, and that was, how many friends have you seen in the last 2 weeks? And if the person said none, red flag, there's potentially a problem there, because relationships are absolutely important for things like preventing depression. And we know that in a whole range of ways, good relationships tend to improve people's well-being and satisfaction, and that's related to a whole lot of very positive health outcomes. So relationships are very important in that sense. People who marry tend to live longer, healthier lives. So I'm looking forward to my marriage in August. I'm going to live forever. People who stay married live longer and report better life quality than those who divorce. But the caveat, of course, that only applies if you're in a happy marriage. If you're not in a happy marriage, perhaps these things don't come across quite strongly. But there's a very strong relationship generally here between good, positive relationships and health. Back here. In terms of forming close relationships, people don't tend to just keep on forming more and more relationships. Typically, people will have something like 4 to 6 people that they regard as really close friends, and everybody else tends to be more on the acquaintance level. So that the people that you tend to feel really close to tends to be around that kind of number. And even in people-rich environments, people tend to cluster into groups. So they tend to cluster into groups of around 6. There's a thing in psychology called the magic number, plus or minus 2, which talks of the way in which we actually deal with a lot of things. But it's true in our relationships with people that we tend to like a small group of people with whom we can relate closely rather than being part of a larger group. And even in crowds, people will tend to group together as a smaller group within that crowd in order to maintain that sense of relationship. What's the attraction? Bit of magnetic attraction. There are certain factors that seem to lead people to actually deciding which relationships they're going to make. And the first one is the thing called propinquity. And simply that means proximity and easy, regular contact. Quite like the term propinquity. There's all these wonderful words crop up in psychology that I think are quite nice, especially because nobody has a clue what they mean. So propinquity, proximity and easy, regular contact. And the other thing is physical attractiveness, similarity, so people tend to look for people who are similar to themselves, and reciprocity, people who like them back. Propinquity is an interesting one. An experiment was done using a housing estate that was being built, and this was in 1950. It was a building complex, apartment buildings, and people were randomly allocated to which apartment they actually lived in. So they were assigned at random. They were all strangers when they moved in. But later on, they were actually asked to name their 3 closest friends within the housing project. And as this propinquity or proximity effect would predict, that in fact most of the people identified as friends were the people who lived closest to within the housing complex. So they didn't tend to have close friends in other buildings. And even within the same building, we found that how close they actually lived tended to be a pretty good estimate of how likely they were to actually form a friendship. So only 10% of those who lived in opposite ends of the hall indicated that they were close friends. The closer you were to the other person physically, the more likely you were to actually say that they were somebody that you were friendly with. So this business of actual proximity and being in regular, easy contact seem to be very important in terms of forming relationships. Mere exposure actually does that to some extent. And this is another experiment that was done where 4 women, supposedly students, took part in a class, and they either went to the class not at all or on 5, 10 or 15 occasions. And then at the end of term, students were asked to rate pictures of the woman in terms of a number of attributes. And what was found was that even though familiarity didn't actually change a lot in terms of their rating. What actually happened was that the more often they'd seen the person, the more attractive they thought they were. And that was a very marked result. So, as we can see here, if you hadn't actually seen the person at all, then you might judge their photograph as quite attractive anyway. Maybe they were. If you'd seen them 5 times, you tended to rate them higher, 10 times higher still, 15 times much higher still again. So this notion of being regularly exposed to somebody actually had a major effect on the attractiveness of that individual. One of the interesting things here is looking at the changes that technology is introducing, and being in regular contact with somebody may not any longer necessarily require you to be in physical contact with people, because you might actually be talking to people on the internet. And it's found that strangers who met on the internet were more attracted to each other than those who met face to face. And one of the reasons for that was that on the internet, the attractiveness was generally judged by the quality of the interaction and the quality of the conversation that you were having with the person, rather than simply things like physical appearance. And of course, that's something that people actually use on the internet, that they can actually be somebody that they regard as more their true self and not be judged simply in terms of their appearance. And you talk to some people with things like disabilities, for example, who will say that that's actually quite important. They're able not to be disabled when they're talking to somebody on the internet. So they're not being judged in terms of physical attractiveness. In the first year, quality of relationships with people that you actually met offline tended to be better. But after a year, if you were still talking to somebody online, the difference between that and a real face-to-face relationship pretty well disappeared. They were just seen as close as people that you actually met physically on a day-to-day basis. So this notion of propinquity can actually happen in different ways rather than necessarily requiring face-to-face meeting. But of course, one of the questions of internet meetings is, do they actually survive when people do meet face-to-face, and other factors begin to become important? That's another issue. Here's a question for you. This guy here. He could be Matt, or he could be John. And tell us a little bit about Matt here, 26 years old, business executive, owns 2 houses, happily married, enjoys traveling, yacht racing and nightclubbing. John, on the other hand, is a 25-year-old, car salesman, rents a small apartment, lives on his own, doesn't have a girlfriend, and has allergies that limit the time that he can spend outdoors. So, do you think this guy is Matt or John? All those who think it's Matt, hands up. Right, all those who think it's John? Right, okay, that's about a 2-to-1 ratio of people who think it's Matt. And the interesting thing about that is that very often we judge people's characteristics based simply on their attractiveness. And so if you thought this guy here was an attractive-looking guy, then you were more likely to actually associate him with these positive attributes.
Halo effect.
Halo effect. In fact, halo is the word I'm going to use in a minute. So there we go. Yeah, exactly that. So let's just look at this. Most people prefer attractive over unattractive. Halo effect, thank you very much. Got in there before me. What is beautiful is good. So you assume that if somebody looks good, they are good. That their attractiveness means that they're actually good at other things. They have other positive traits. Attractive children are more popular with peers and teachers. That's something that's been shown again and again in things like school studies. Babies prefer attractive faces. Even at a very early stage, babies are making judgments about what's attractive and not attractive. And attractive people generally are seen to have more career success and be more successful in life generally. And yet, a lot of us get a bit worried about that. Just before I go on to talking about the worries about that, let's just look at what actually makes women attractive. Studies have shown that these are the characteristics of women's faces, just looking at faces really in this instance, that tend to make women seem attractive. So you can decide whether or not you agree with some of these. And we can look at men, and there's a similar list for men, a shorter list. Women are perhaps not looking at as many things. One of the interesting ones on both of them is symmetry. And that is people whose faces look symmetrical about the nose line. People who've got very asymmetric faces, they tend to be judged as less attractive. But anyway, getting on to physical attractiveness and the ups and downs of that. When people are asked about the qualities that they're looking for in a partner, most people don't say physical attractiveness, despite what the Matt and John does. But when you look at their actual behavior, what they actually do in real life situations, it's very clear that attractiveness plays a major part in who they actually choose to have relationships with. Now, is that because people are simply unaware that they're doing that? Are they unaware that they're choosing attractiveness? Or is it that they're unwilling to admit that that's the factor? And in fact, the studies show that it's the latter, that in fact, people are quite well aware that that's what they're doing, but they don't like to admit it because it doesn't sound good. It makes them sound shallow. So, even though that's what they're doing, they're actually quite clearly judging on the basis of attractiveness and know that they're doing that. And although both sexes tend to value attractiveness, there is some literature that shows that men do so more than women, and I'll leave you all up to decide what you want to make of that comment. Similarity, do opposites attract? Well, actually, there's very little evidence that opposites attract, that we tend to like other people who are similar to us. Otherwise, we experience what's called cognitive dissonance. How can we like this person when they're not actually like us? Because we like us, we think we're okay. And if this person is too different, why would we be liking them? It doesn't make sense. So this notion of cognitive dissonance. Spouses are similar in many regards. So you tend to find that people who actually marry each other are similar in things like level of IQ. My partner always tells me, you wish, Physical attractiveness, education, socioeconomic status, and the interests and opinions and experiences they've had. And couples more similar in attractiveness are more likely to progress to committed relationships with each other. And so I won't ask you to compare me and Ray just in case. There's a thing called the matching hypothesis, which says that people are attracted to and form relationships with others who seem similar to themselves in appearance and physical attractiveness. And perhaps it doesn't just apply to relationships. Reciprocity, the notion that, if people like us, we tend to like them. So it fuels our attraction to that person. Reciprocal liking sometimes is a self-fulfilling prophecy, because if two people, if you're showing that you like someone, then they're more inclined to think, oh, this is quite a nice person, I'll like them back. So you tend to get that sort of reciprocal effect. If someone likes you, initially it's very favorable, but if that person, if the liking is not returned, then it can become quite a burden in that sense. And we tend to prefer relationships that are psychologically balanced. I like you, you like me, that's psychologically balanced. That seems okay, that's a good relationship. The interesting thing is, and this is one which intrigued me a bit, is what's known as the gain-loss hypothesis. And what this is showing is the difference between the initial reaction that somebody has to you and their later reaction to you. And what shows is here, if the person initially doesn't like you, but then comes to like you like them very much. If the person likes you in the beginning and continues to like you, that's pretty okay too. If the person never liked you and never likes you even in the future, then that's down a bit. But the worst situation is if somebody initially liked you and then decides they don't like you, that's pretty rotten. So what we actually find is that we like people most if they initially disliked us, but later come to like us. We think, there you are, you see they learn to make the right choice at the end of the day. And that seems pretty good to us. There are some interesting situations of non-reciprocity. People with negative self-concept don't tend to like people who like them because they don't think they deserve to be liked. So they tend to be a bit suspicious if somebody likes them. And that's one of the oddities that we find with personality traits. People who have low self-esteem and a negative self-view in their personality get a bit upset if they're with people who like or appear to like them very much, because their basic concept is, I don't deserve this, this can't be real. So that's the one exception. Why love? Well, there's the evolutionary theory, and that is that love helps to secure good mating relationships. There's the attachment theory, in that love helps to create emotional security, a bit like the attachment we saw developing in young children. And the other one is what's known as the social exchange theory, that there's a mutual cost-benefit analysis goes on here, which people undertake in relation to relationships. So they think about what are the rewards here, what are the potential costs of this relationship, how does it compare to other relationships that I've actually had before. That feeds into satisfaction with the relationship. But also there's, how much am I actually putting into this? What do I stand to lose if it all goes wrong? What other alternatives are around? Is there somebody who might be a better relationship? In which case, I might be considering that. And all these feed into your sense of commitment to the relationship and ultimately to the stability of that relationship. So that's what the social exchange theory says. There's a kind of implicit cost-benefit analysis goes on in the relationships. And there are two distinct kinds of love which are often identified. There is passionate love, which is what we all think of, the romantic stuff that you get in the movies, etc. And there's companionate love, which is a more calm and stable thing that's there over a period of time as people develop a relationship in lots of different ways. So the passionate love tends to be very thrilling, roller coaster of emotions style stuff, whereas the companionate love tends to be a much more stable and potentially lasting relationship marked by things like trust. And there's a sort of triangle which was developed by a chap called Sternberg, which said that there's three elements that are important: intimacy, passion, and commitment. And that forms a kind of triangle, and depending on how many of the bits you've got is the quality of the love that you actually have. So if you have all three, then you have the best kind of love going on here in the middle. If you have just passion and intimacy, that might be the kind of romantic love that's very nice while it lasts, but doesn't last necessarily very long. You've got companionate love, where perhaps it's no longer as passionate as it once used to be, but there's a lot of trust and investment and sharing that's going on there that actually maintains it on quite a different level, even though the passion may not be there to the same extent. And you've got the kind of fatuous love, which is that there's commitment here and that I want this, and there's a lot of passion, but beyond that, there's really nothing holding it together at all, because there's no real intimacy involved, there's no real sharing involved, there's no real giving up something of yourself in that relationship whatsoever. And we find that in most cultures, we get much the same kinds of attitudes to things like love. So it's something which actually transcends culture, although there are some different ways in which that's sometimes expressed and talked about, some different attitudes around how it's supposed to work. But pretty well every culture in the world recognizes something about passionate love. Does love last? Well, as I was suggesting there, passionate love is often temporary. It's the heat of the moment stuff. It's while the hormones are raging type stuff. And successful relationships tend to shift from passionate love to companionate love. And this is a nice little graph that shows the kind of way in which the change takes place. So initially, things are very high in passion, but passion begins to drop off. But if you're actually committed to the relationship, the companionate love is growing during all that time. It's the other depths of love, the other depths of meaning about love that are becoming more important. And so after 10 years, you find that passion has generally dropped to a lower level, but companionship has generally increased quite markedly. Healthy relationships tend to have a number of characteristics. Things like freedom within the relationship. You trust the person within the relationship. You allow them that freedom. You respect their differences. You have equality within the relationship. And as my partner will always tell me, that comes down to, do you do your share of the housework? Communication is very important. Talking to people, actually sharing your inner thoughts and feelings with the other person are absolutely crucial. If you're not engaging in that kind of communication, self-disclosure, then the relationship doesn't tend to last. And these are just 10 guidelines which come out quite strongly about what makes good relationships. Having mutually meaningful goals, sharing and equity, communication, it's good to talk and to listen. Sometimes listening is actually more important than talking. Trust and freedom, positive perception, feedback and encouragement. That's encouraging the other person to some extent to be the best that they can be, to let them know what's good about them, to reinforce the things that you see in them that are actually good things to be, good things to have, that help them to develop a strong sense of self. Acceptance and respect. If things are causing problems, it's important to challenge the behavior rather than the person. So you say, what you're doing is something I don't like very much, rather than saying, you're always rubbish, you shouldn't be doing that. Honourable compromise, because relationships have to be about balance. Not everybody wins every argument. Alex always reminds me that one of my favourite sayings is that the best outcome is not where anyone wins, but where nobody believes they have lost. And very often that's the basis of honourable compromise. Intimacy is important. It remains important throughout relationships. And love is in the details. It's often small things that people do that are actually seen as the biggest indicators of whether that love and relationship is there and going to last. It's being aware of each other on a day-to-day basis, even in small things. On the other hand, there are 4 conflict styles that are known to be very damaging to relationships. So things like criticism, so constantly criticizing a partner is likely to be very damaging to a relationship. Contempt, where you make it clear that you don't have trust and respect for the other person. Defensiveness, where you're so busy defending yourself that you're not actually taking on board what the other person's concerns are. And stonewalling, well, I'm just not going to talk about that. Can't be bothered, yeah. I'm too busy doing other things. Can't deal with this. And these are the kinds of things that we know are very damaging to relationships. And on that note, I'm going to stop. So, thanks for listening. I hope you've learned something interesting about relationships. And I always flag up this site, which is a site called allaboutpsychology.com, which is a wonderful site for getting all kinds of information about psychology on the net. So well worth having a look at. And the other thing is that I run a group called the Edinburgh Philosophy and Psychology Group, which meets every month, where we get to discuss lots of interesting things, including things like relationships. So, thank you very much.
Well, thanks very much, Mike. Brilliant. Would you be all right with taking a few questions? Well, can anybody read this?
Hi, I have a question regarding the Asperger's diet.
Yep.
It seems that you're implying that Asperger's spectrum is has been relationship deficit. Is that actually been clinically proved rather than it being that in multiple origins?
Asperger's is one of these sort of funny things. It's become a popular diagnosis, and I'm always a bit suspicious of that because sometimes popular diagnoses tend to oversimplify things in lots of ways. And when I was referring to that particular aspect of Asperger's, I was referring really to simply one aspect in terms of how it affects relationships in particular. There's a lot of debate about whether it actually belongs in the autistic spectrum disorders at all, or whether it's down to other kinds of things. And as far as I'm aware at the moment, and I haven't been following this up recently, there's no really strong conclusions have been reached either way. The thing that worries me is that sometimes I think people are being diagnosed with Asperger's who do have difficulties, but who are not necessarily in that category and perhaps might be better dealt with in some other way. And equally, I think sometimes people fail to be diagnosed with Asperger's when they could actually be considerably helped if that was actually noted as being their key problem. So I'm not sure I have a complete answer for you.
I had Asperger's diagnosed 10 years ago, explained a life problem, hurt beyond the limits of language. Fortunately, I'm endowed with a phenomenal ability to write, and I have written a portfolio of short stories with Asperger's characters, some of which were extremely tragic, on a point of view of artist sufferer, particularly one about a character with the name John Barney, who, when gratuitously humiliated, tries to meet me, but in fact tries head on with a little bit. And that story is very poignant because the last moment of John Barney's life, he is shouting at himself. He really hates himself. He believes that he's dirty, he's unfriended, he's unlovable, and all the things that my father did me to do. That I was not likable. I had besetting failings. I was even in trouble having one black and one brown spectacle hook on my face, but I'm there because I had floated the glasses from Fire Road and had a new foot fixed back to university. And uproar over that, over growing a beard.
I think if I remember rightly that some of your stuff is going to be actually on the... You're going to put up some stories on the site, I think?
Yes.
So it might be interesting for people to follow that up. And what you're saying about, the way in which you were dealt with by your father comes back to what I was saying about the importance of relationships. Can I just move on to perhaps there are one or two other people who wanted to say something?
You just sort of touched on that a little bit, the idea of passion.
Yeah.
Could you explain that a little bit? Yeah, how did you get into, or how does one develop by accident a relationship that's intimate? Was it that? It's passionate and commitment about intimacy.
Well, I mean, the easiest thing to do is to give you an example, and that would be, say, someone who says, I'm addicted to sex, I have regular relationships where there's a lot of passion, where I'm committed to that person for the time being, but basically there's nothing in it beyond that. I'm not really interested in them as a person. I'm not really interested in developing long-term relationships. I'm just looking for immediate sexual satisfaction. Now, I mean, I'm always aware when you're giving examples like that it's never quite that easy or quite that simple. But, there are ways in which people can develop a relationship where they're committed at the time and that they want it because it says something about them. It helps to build their sense of self-esteem or self-worth in some way. There's certainly passion in terms of the sexual passion, but beyond that, there's nothing.
So commitment doesn't imply time.
Well, it might imply time because, sometimes you look at these relationships and they actually go on over years. There's been many cases in the press, for example, of people who've been married for years but had an ongoing mistress that's been there in the background for 5, 10, 20 years. So, commitment can be there in that sense, but there's never the sense that that relationship is going to develop into anything else. It's always been shuffled off into a corner somewhere and doesn't have the kind of meaning that other relationships can have. That's just one example. I'm probably others. Back down.
Assuming that social relationships are things larger, why is it not like? Why is it like we don't perpetually seek close friendships? As you said earlier, that we sort of perpetually keep on seeking friendship after friendship after friendship. Why is that?
Well, generally speaking, people will develop a number of close relationships that are around them at any given time. So, as you move through life, your relationships may change. I lived for a long time in Liverpool. A lot of the people I was close to Liverpool are now in Liverpool, and I'm not particularly close to them now. So coming to Edinburgh, I have developed a different set of close relationships. But the notion is that in terms of people that you feel are really close to you, people that you feel are your best friend and that you share everything with, it tends throughout your life to come down to any given time, there are something like 4 to 6 people that you feel that close with. And that's not to say you don't have relationships with other people, but these other people are more on the acquaintance level. You meet them for a drink in the pub. I go to my science fiction group on a Tuesday night and we all have a good time and have a good chat, but they're not necessarily the people I would consider to be my really best friends that I would share intimate details of my life with. So that's the kind of difference, that we tend to limit the number of people who we allow to get that close at any given time, although that may change throughout life if we move around, for example, or if friends move around. We'll tend to replace them with somebody else to make up that 4 to 6. You are?
I'm fascinated by this idea that after a year of being friends with somebody online, that becomes similar to something that you've known in physical reality. I was wondering where that information came from. Because I have friends online and I've often thought, oh my God, this is really freakish. Because I've never met these people, I've never known these people, but I feel very close to them. And I must be some kind of in that case. Because I've just, and I'm talking to them about very personal things. And there's one person in particular that I meet on a daily basis, and we both feel very strange we don't actually meet up. It's kind of, so I'm not sure how that seems to operate.
I'm tempted to say, of course you're in that case, but so is everybody else. No, but, I think that's a very good example. The way in which we know this is because obviously internet relationships has been something that's been subject to a lot of scrutiny because people are very interested in what is things like social networking doing to the way in which we actually relate to people. And some people say, well, it's replacing the normal, genuine friendships, it's replacing ordinary communication. Other people say, well, no, it's not actually doing that. It's simply providing an enhanced environment in which you can experience all these things. But the research, which actually looks at what happens to people and what do they report, gave the result that I gave, that after a year, if you've maintained a relationship online for a year, then you tend to see it with the same value as you would somebody you were actually meeting face to face.
You said about old people going in if they hadn't seen any friends. If, say, in 10 years' time, somebody goes in and says, well, I haven't seen any friends, but I've spoken to 5 people in the last week online, would that still be a red flag?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. One of the reasons that I don't know the answer to that is because the group of people about whom we were looking for that were older people who are less likely to be the kind of people that are currently on the net. That's going to change because all the people who are my age now, 63, so I'm an older person anyway, but all the people who are my age now are going to be well versed in things like the net and are going to see that as an outlet. So I don't know. It may well be that in future online friendships are going to be protective against depression in the same way as face-to-face ones currently are.
I mean, I find it quite strange because I go into Second Life like this. A lot of people that I hang around with want to go shopping, which I don't like in real life anyway. So I have no idea why they think I want to go shopping in my fantasy bar, you know.
Yep. Somebody else? Yep. Lady here. I think there's different levels in which you can answer that. But I mean, one thing is it depends what you think beauty is. And one of the suggestions, which I was hinting at a bit there, is it may simply be physical characteristics of somebody which are regarded as contributing to beauty quite differently from things like cultural norms, etc. So something like symmetry, for example, babies tend to be more attracted to people with symmetrical faces. I mean, babies are attracted to different things at different stages. One of the important things, for example, is that once they've established a strong relationship with their mother, they're actually more prepared to explore things which look a bit strange or different. Initially, they want everything to be very familiar, and they get quite upset if something strange is introduced into the scenario. That as they actually feel secure in their attachment and relationships, they're more willing to tolerate strangeness and difference and explore. So, depending on what stage you're looking at children, you may see slightly different kinds of behaviour based on the level of attachment they have at that time. I'm aware that we're running well into the break time.
Well, there's plenty more food. And once again, thank you, Ray.